Rangers, forest workers, hunters, and other woods people of Reddit, what is your scary experience in the woods that you still can't explain? I've lived in the Smokies most of my life. Anywhere I've lived in the Smokies, I've been completely surrounded by woods, naturally. One night at like 1 a.m., I was sitting on my porch drinking a beer. If you haven't lived out here, during the summertime, nature is loud. It isn't quiet. Cicadas humming, frogs belching, etc. It's like the ultimate white noise. While I was drinking my beer, I had noticed that everything in the woods had gone quiet. Which is pretty easy to notice when you live here because that doesn't happen. Suddenly, I heard the most terrifying noise I had ever heard about, I think maybe a good 30 or 40 meters away from me. It was a loud shrieking, literally blood-curdling scream like shrill. It sounded non-human. It wasn't a mountain lion because I've heard them before, and they're rare in the area I lived. I stood up, audibly said nope. And walked the fleeb inside. That was the one and only time that ever happened. I still live in the same house and still drink the same beer on the same porch. Kind of creepy thing happened to me when I was a student forester this summer. So, the forest I was working in was about 20 km from the nearest town, which contained around 1,200 people, and we usually set out for whatever task we have to do in the forest at around 7 a.m. So we are at the forest at around 7:30 a.m. and we are about 12 km up the road when we turn a corner very slowly and see what I initially thought to be a weird-looking bush or statue, but it was in fact a person sitting on a carved-out stump on the side of the road, just sitting there. What really threw me off was the fact that this person had a parka on and a balaclava underneath it in the middle of summer. We drove by this person real slow, and he lifted a hand to wave slowly as we drove past, and it was just super creepy. Never saw them again after that, but it did make going out on excursions a little more uneasy sometimes when alone. We have a camp that we visit during the hunting months and about every other weekend in between that. To get to our camp, you have to turn off of a major road onto a gravel road, drive about a mile, then turn onto another gravel road for about a half mile. It's set between a few other camps, plus some residents that live out there. It's quiet, for the most part. There are some coyotes and bobcats. Bobcats are the worst due to their terrible scream. It sounds like a woman crying for help. There has also been a black panther and wild dogs. 2013 we were at the camp for Thanksgiving. We hunted, fished, cooked, drank, all that good camp stuff. On night, we're sitting around a fire, swapping funny stories and just listening to the silence of the woods. As we're talking, we all hear, "Help me." At first, we thought it was a bobcat. We listened some more and heard it again. It was a man's voice yelling "help me." Repeatedly. Now, our first instinct was to grab our guns. Second was to go towards the voice, but you never know what you will encounter in the woods. It was dark and cold. The hunters knew the area very well. We called the police and explained everything to the responding officers. The weird part was that we never once heard it while the officers were with us. Not once. The officers left and we heard the man again, repeating "help me." About half an hour later, the officers came back and we didn't hear any call for help. Again, silence. We all decided it was best to go inside our camp for the night. We never did find out anything. I've only been back to the camp once since then. Really freaked me out. I live in South Spain, near some really ancient forest called Los Alcornicales, which has some kind of trees that are almost extant and only grow here and in another 2 or so places. It's a bit of a rocky terrain, and if you ever are walking on the forest and try to climb some rocks, you should be really careful because usually you can have caves and hollow spaces under your feet and you can fall easily. So, my father and his friends usually go hiking on Thursdays so they don't find anyone on the woods besides maybe a shepherd or a forest worker, and on this day, they decided to climb a really large and rocky hill. My uncle Frank remembered that when he was young, he slept on a little cave when he went hunting and got lost, and he wanted to try to find that cave. After a few hours, they find the cave. It was covered in moss and grime, but it was surely the same cave. One of my father's friend, John, tried to get as far as possible into the cave because he was in a really good shape and wanted to see all of it. The rest of them waited outside. Suddenly, John started screaming and calling for my father. He went inside and turned on his torch. Inside of the cave was a really weird shrine or something like that, with candles, 2 apples, bones, pieces of coal and ashes on the ground, a pair of gloves, a pot and a pan, etc. Everything looked really old and dusty, and it was clear it hadn't been touched in a long time. My father went to the shrine and it had a little bowl, and when he looked inside, there was something that looked like human teeth. When they got out, they packed up all their things and got out of there really fast. My father refuses to hike around there anymore, and they started hiking on the other side of the hill and into the woods. All of this was really strange, and I've never heard of something like this before. I don't know anything about voodoo or this kind of things, but my father said it looked like some voodoo shrine or some stuff like that. If any of you guys know something like this, I would appreciate an explanation. Not my story, but my younger sister's, early 20s. She was in Colorado last year and went hiking with her friend. The plan was to hike up the mountain, stop midway and camp, then finish the hike the next morning. They started their hike and stopped for camp midway. She said it started dumping rain that night, which meant the top would most likely be snow. The next morning they continued their hike, but it started getting complicated. Her friend only wore Chaco sandals and not proper hiking boots as they didn't expect the snow. They stopped at a creek and were deciding if they wanted to turn back on account they weren't prepared properly when they heard a faint "help me." They both stood still. They heard it again. They decided to follow up the creek to the woman's voice. They got to a clearing that was covered in snow and found a woman laying in it in basic athletic clothing, leggings, light pullover jacket, and athletic shoes. My sister said her legs were swollen, discolored, and had nasty cuts on them. My sister asked her how long she had been out there, and the woman said only a few hours. My sister was like, "Okay, we need to get you down this mountain." The woman was like, "No, I need to go up the mountain, that's where my car is parked." My sister was like, "No, there is no driving access at the top of the mountain," which was a sign that this woman was confused. They get her down the mountain, and my sister just kept saying how confused this woman was. They get to the bottom and they find this woman's car. My sister couldn't get cell service to call 911 during this BTW. Anyways, my sister tells this woman she's going to drive her to the hospital, but the woman is standing strong that she would just like to go back to her bed and breakfast. My sister takes her there while driving this woman's car. Once the woman is at the bed and breakfast, she thanks them and goes in. My sister spoke to the owners and was like, "You have to call a medic, she is severely confused and not acting normal." They call a medic and transport her to a hospital. Turns out, this woman is from Chicago, has low blood pressure, and it was her first time ever hiking a mountain. She was also alone. She had passed out during her hike, then it dumped snow on her. She was hypothermic and only thought she'd been out for a few hours. She was out overnight in the dark, cold and alone. I couldn't imagine the terror she must have felt. Anyways, my sister went and saw her at the hospital, and the woman thanked her for saving her life. They still lightly keep in touch. A few years back, when I was around the age of 14 and my brother was 9, my dad, my little brother, and I all went out deer hunting in the afternoon right before sundown. While we were walking through the woods, before we even got started, my little brother tugged on my arm and asked me if I saw that. I said that it was probably his imagination and he let go of my arm. A few minutes later, I couldn't hear him walking behind us anymore and turned around to find him gone. I quickly told my dad and we looked for him for, at the least, half an hour when he walked over out of nowhere towards the both of us. He was covered in mud like he'd fallen somewhere. I worriedly asked where he'd gone and he just stared at me, telling me that he couldn't remember and thought that he had never left. He acted normally afterwards just as nothing had happened. I don't know if this is really scary to anyone else, but it shook my entire family, including myself, quite a bit. Edit. To answer a few of your questions. Several of you have been asking whether or not he could tell or show me where he had been, and the answer is no. As I said, although I hadn't specified, so that might have been on me, he told me that he couldn't remember a thing. Not what happened, not why he was covered in mud, not why he had walked away in the first place, nor that he had walked away at all. The only thing that he said he could recall was walking a few steps away from us after seeing a doe from behind him, and that's it. He told me that he genuinely hadn't remembered walking away from us and acted like no time had passed. Also, one of you had asked how muddy it was. I distinctly remember that we had several flood warnings and heavy rains before then, but it wasn't like knee-high deep mud. It had been in the middle of fall, and I can remember myself being irritated at the mud and leaves sticking to my boots. He wasn't drenched in mud after we found him, but his knees and the palms of his hands were coated in it, along with having a few splotches here and there on his clothes. I had one other question on whether or not I asked him what he saw in the first place. He had initially told me after the entire event that he had saw a glimpse of a tall person standing next to a tree, which I, to be completely honest, doubt. As a kid, I also had one hell of an imagination and was very paranoid, which I believe was passed down from my mother to the two of us. Lastly, someone had asked how I had found him. I'm not sure if that's the right way to word it. Anyways, all three of us had been walking north, and later on, when I did find him, he had trotted out of the woods, avoiding trees, from the west. Before he had gotten to me, he hadn't really spoke until I ran up to him and hugged him, asking if he was okay. I hope this answers most of the questions you had. Friend and I were hiking in the woods. He was at the camp and I went to check on things about half a mile away. Suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, the woods became silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just a most eerie silence I've experienced. After a few minutes, it suddenly went back to normal forest noises. Thinking I must have had a seizure or temporary deafness or something, I hurry back to camp, only to see my friend standing there with a confused, scared look on his face. I must have had a similar look because he immediately asked if I heard the silence. We tried to come up with an explanation, but absolute silence in the woods seems impossible. Even more so that it was so sudden. About 20 years ago, I had just finished my degree and was bummed because I couldn't find a job. A former roommate good friend and I went on an overnight backpack trip near Burr Oak State Park in southeast Ohio. About 2 a.m., we were woken in our tent by the sound of dozens of horses being ridden all around us. We could hear muted conversation, harness jingling, hoofs clopping, and we could feel it shaking the ground. We laid in our tent and the sound just kept on, like a whole convoy was passing right beside us. After a few minutes, we unzipped the tent and the sounds immediately ceased and nothing was there. It was freaky, we were afraid they were going to ride over us. It was so intense. I have no idea who or what it was, but we're camped on a trail that had been used by John Morgan Hunt's Confederate raiders during the Civil War. Not a logical explanation, but it was deafening, there were so many horses. I can still hear men's voices murmuring as they rode by. Next morning, not a single hoofprint to be found.